The windmill's groan cut through the late afternoon heat, a sharp metallic cry that told Elias McKenna something had gone wrong. He dropped the sack of feed by the corral fence and strode toward the sound, boots sinking into the loose dust. The cattle clustered near the empty trough, their low, restless balls rising in the shimmering air. Water in August was no small thing to take for granted, and out here a bad pump could turn trouble fast. The wind spun the blades slow and lazy, but the pump's rod juddered, coughing without pulling a drop. Elias wiped his forearm across his brow, then gripped the handle of his wrench. He didn't waste words on cursing. The sun was already sinking, and the animals needed drinking before night cooled the land. Kneeling by the pipe, he loosened the bolts, listening to the rasp of metal on metal. The air smelled of hot iron and dry grass. Somewhere beyond the fence line, a meadowlark trilled, then fell silent. With a practiced hand, he bled the line, primed the pump, and eased the rod back into place. The first sputter of water came like a sigh of relief, steadying, welcome. The trough began to fill, and the balls of the herd softened to a low murmur. He leaned against the post a moment, watching the water swirl. From here, the plain stretched in all directions, waves of gold grass under the weight of the sun. Sage grew in scattered clumps, releasing its clean, sharp scent when the wind brushed through. To the west, the horizon quivered in the heat, blurring the low hills into a single line. A shadow shifted across his thoughts, the way it sometimes did when the work was done and the silence settled too heavy. The chair on the porch sat angled toward the sunset, its twin long gone. In the kitchen, a second cup still hung on the rack, enamel chipped at the rim. He carried the things he'd lost quietly, as a man might carry an old scar, hidden under the shirt, but there all the same. For no reason he could name, a verse rose to mind, one his mother used to say when the house felt too empty. God sets the lonely in families. He let it pass without dwelling, pushing away from the post. There was still light enough for a ride along the fence line. He saddled the bay gelding and turned toward the outer pasture. Dust rose in soft clouds behind the hooves, drifting into the warm air. Grasshoppers clicked from the weeds at the trail's edge. The world out here was wide and plain-spoken, its truths written in seasons and weather, in the steady cycle of care and repair. Half a mile out, the trail bent along a shallow rise. From the top, he could see the old milepost where his property line met the county road. It leaned a little now, bleached near white by years of sun. Usually it stood alone, save for the sagebrush huddled at its base. But today a shape broke the pattern, still upright where no shadow should be. He slowed the gelding, narrowing his eyes against the glare. The figure resolved into the outline of a person, slight, with one hand braced against the post. Cloth hung in loose folds from her frame, the skirt's hem ragged. For a moment he thought she might be resting, but something in the tilt of her shoulders said otherwise. He felt the shift in the air before he knew its cause, a quiet prickle of awareness that the day's work was no longer the only matter at hand. Somewhere far off, the first coyote of the evening called, its voice thin against the vastness. Elias kept his gaze on the figure ahead, the gelding slowing to a walk under his steady hand. Something had changed in the heat, and the horizon knew it first. The gelding's ears flicked forward as Elias drew nearer. The figure by the milepost was a woman, young, maybe, though it was hard to tell beneath the dust. Her dress had once been a soft green, now dulled to the color of sage leaves left too long in the sun. The hem was torn and frayed, threads curling like dry grass. One sleeve hung loose, the cuff darkened where sweat and dirt had soaked in. Her boots were scuffed nearly to the sole, the laces knotted in mismatched lengths. Both hands were pressed to her right side, as if to hold herself together. Her head turned slightly at the sound of hooves, and he saw the shadow of a wince cross her face. Elias slowed to a stop a few paces away. He didn't speak right off. Out here, rushing a skittish animal or a stranger in trouble often ended the same way. Her eyes, dark and steady, slid from him to the road behind, measuring the space as though she might need to run. "You hurt?" he asked, his voice low. She hesitated, then answered, barely above the hum of the wind. "Ribs," she said. "I can walk." The last words trembled, betraying more than she likely meant to. He swung down from the saddle, keeping one hand on the reins. "Walking's not what you need right now." Her shoulders stiffened at his approach. He stopped within arm's length, close enough to see the fading blue of old bruises beneath the edge of her bodice, and the fresher purple blooming there too. "Let me help you up," he said. His tone stayed even, not a command, not a plea. Her gaze stayed fixed on him, weighing. Then, with a small nod, she let him take her elbow. The muscles in her arm were taut, coiled like wire. He moved slow, giving her time to see each motion before it came. He lifted her into the saddle sideways so she wouldn't have to twist. She gripped the horn with pale-knuckled fingers, boots dangling just above the stirrup. Elias mounted behind her, leaving space so her breathing wasn't pressed. The gelding started forward at an easy pace, hooves thudding softly on the packed dirt. Neither spoke. The tall grass whispered against their boots as they passed, the late sun laying long shadows across the trail. He could feel the tremor in her frame, not from the air, which was still warm, but from something lodged deeper. By the time they reached the cabin, dusk was pulling the color from the hills. Smoke from the chimney drifted in a slow ribbon, carrying the scent of pine kindling. Elias swung down first, then turned to lift her. She hesitated, her gaze flicking from the porch to the dark line of the horizon, as if weighing whether this place could be trusted. He offered his hand. After a beat, she took it. Inside, the cabin held the day's heat, mellowed by the glow of a single oil lamp. The table bore the remains of his noon meal, half a loaf of bread, the coffee pot still half full. A narrow bed stood in the corner, a cedar chest at its foot. He nodded toward a chair. "Sit." She lowered herself carefully, one hand still at her ribs. He poured water into a tin cup and set it before her. She drank in small swallows, eyes never fully leaving him. From the chest he drew a clean shirt, faded but whole, and set it over the back of the chair. "You can use this until your dress is mended." Her fingers brushed the fabric, pausing there. Something unspoken passed in that pause, a measure, perhaps, of the kind of man she'd found herself with. He moved to the stove, striking a match to the pine he'd laid earlier. The fire snapped softly. Outside, the wind shifted, carrying the faint scent of rain that hadn't yet come. By nightfall, the house would remember 2 breaths instead of 1. If you found this helpful, a quick like really helps us keep creating. By morning, the wind had stilled, and the sky stretched pale and cloudless. Elias rose before the sun cleared the hills, stoked the stove, and set the kettle on. The quiet was the same as always, except now there was the sound of another breath in the room. Clara sat propped in the chair near the hearth, knees drawn up slightly, the blanket folded over her lap. She looked as though she'd slept, but her eyes carried that hollow glaze of someone who had kept waking through the night. He saw the tension in her shoulders, the way her gaze flicked to the door each time the floorboards creaked. "You'll need to stay off your feet a while," Elias said, pouring hot water into the coffee pot. "Ribs don't heal quick if you keep pulling at them." "I can manage," she answered, voice low. She shifted in the chair, her breath catching when she leaned too far to one side. The wince was quick, but not quick enough for him to miss. Outside, chores wouldn't wait. He stepped into the yard, the air still cool with the last of the night. The chickens fussed near the coop, and the bay gelding stamped at the post, ready for feed. Elias moved through the motions, scatter grain, fill troughs, check fence wire, always listening for a sound from the cabin. When he came back in, she was where he'd left her, the blanket pulled tighter. The lamp on the table cast a soft amber glow, catching on the curve of her cheekbone. He set a tin cup of warm water on the small table beside her. "Drink," he said simply. She took it, cradling the cup between both hands as though testing its warmth before trusting it. The steam curled up, faint against the pale morning light. They passed the hours in a kind of shared quiet, not the brittle silence of mistrust, but the measured stillness of people learning each other's presence. He worked at the table, mending a leather strap, the slow pull of the needle through the hide marking the time. She sat near the fire, eyes half-lidded, the blanket rising and falling with her breathing. When the sun slipped higher, Elias rose to fetch more wood. The door creaked on its hinges, and in that instant Clara's body tensed. Her eyes snapped open, and she gripped the chair's arm, every muscle braced. "It's just me," he said, pausing in the doorway. The tension eased a little, but not all the way. She let out a slow breath, gaze darting once to the window before settling on the fire again. By mid-afternoon, the cabin had warmed with the scent of pine from the stove. Elias set a pot of stew on the back burner, the lid rattling softly as it simmered. "Won't be long now," he said. She nodded, not looking up from the steam curling from her cup. The day moved in a rhythm. His steps outside, the scrape of wood on the porch, the steady pop of the fire inside. Shadows lengthened along the floorboards as the sun bent west. When the kettle sang again, he poured her a fresh cup and set it beside her without a word. She looked at it for a moment, then at him, and a small nod passed between them, unspoken thanks. As dusk came on, Elias checked the latch on the door, the habit of years. Outside, the last light clung to the far ridge before slipping away. Night folded around the house, and the quiet held, but it was a watchful quiet now. The next morning, Clara was still in the chair by the hearth, but she'd pushed the blanket aside. The fire had burned down to a faint glow, and the air in the cabin held the faint scent of coffee and cold ash. Elias came in from the yard, brushing the dust from his sleeves. "You're up early," he said, setting a basket of eggs on the table. "I couldn't sleep," she replied, eyes lowered. Then, after a pause, didn't want to just sit. He noticed her gaze drifting toward a pile of clean laundry on the far bench, shirts folded from yesterday's wash. When he returned from storing the eggs, the shirts were stacked neater, edges lined as straight as fence boards. "Didn't have to do that," he said. "I know." Her voice was quiet, but there was a trace of firmness there, like she needed him to understand it was her choice. Through the day, she found other small tasks. Dusting the shelf above the stove, straightening jars in the pantry. Moving slow, careful not to twist her ribs, but moving nonetheless. At midday, while Elias worked in the corral, he caught a faint sound drifting from the cabin window, a thread of humming. It was low, unsteady, but unmistakable. By the time he stepped inside, she had stopped, the moment tucked away like something not meant to be noticed. Later that afternoon, he found her kneeling at the edge of the porch, her hands sifting through the soil where the morning shade lingered. A small paper packet lay open beside her, flower seeds, a scattering of pale shapes against the dark dirt. "You planting something?" he asked, leaning on the porch post. "They're just wildflowers," she said, pressing a seed into the earth. "Saw them in Mrs. Carver's shop last time you went to town. Thought maybe they'd do here." He watched her work, slow and deliberate, as though the act itself was as important as the result. The packet lay open, the breeze stirring the edge of the paper. "I read once," she said, without looking up, "that you can't rush flowers. They come when they're ready, no matter how much you watch the ground." Something in her tone made him think she wasn't only talking about flowers. He remembered a verse his mother used to say when she planted her spring garden. "To bestow on them a crown of beauty instead of ashes, the oil of joy instead of mourning," Isaiah 61:3. He didn't speak it aloud, but the words settled in his mind as he watched Clara press another seed into the soil. By evening, the row of planted ground was marked with a few small stones she'd set in place. Inside, the scent of stew filled the cabin. She moved slower now, fatigue in her steps, but there was something steadier in her posture. Over supper, they spoke little, but when she reached for the salt, her sleeve brushed his hand. She didn't flinch. As the fire burned low, Elias sat at the table mending a strap while Clara rinsed the bowls. It wasn't much, but it was the first time they'd moved around each other in the small space without the edges of their silence catching. Outside, the wind stirred through the grass, carrying the scent of turned earth from the porch edge. Seeds buried, waiting for their time. 4 days after the seeds went into the ground, Elias hitched the wagon for a supply run. Clara was by the porch rail, sleeves rolled, hair loosely tied back. "You can stay here if you'd rather," he said, handing her the option without pressing. She studied the horizon for a moment, the long road running east toward town. "I'll come," she said finally. "Don't think I should hide from every set of eyes." The ride started in silence. The wagon wheels groaned against the packed earth, and the morning air still held a cool edge. Clara's hands were folded in her lap, fingers laced tightly together. As the open plain gave way to the edges of town, Elias noticed the way she scanned ahead, not for scenery, but for trouble. The main street was already stirring. Store shutters propped open, horses tied along the boardwalk, the smell of fresh bread drifting from the bakery. He pulled up in front of the general store. Mrs. Carver stepped out from behind the counter as the bell over the door jingled. "Well now," she said warmly, "you've brought company today." Her gaze lingered on Clara just long enough to read the quiet in her posture. "Helpin' Elias keep the place in order, are ya?" Clara gave a polite nod but said nothing. Elias caught the way her eyes flickered toward the shelves, anywhere but the stairs. They moved through the store at an easy pace. He gathered coffee, flour, lamp oil. Clara trailed a few steps behind, pausing by a shelf of seed packets, her fingers brushing a label as if testing its texture. The door opened, and 2 women stepped in, their chatter cutting short the moment they spotted Clara. They stepped aside to let her pass, but their eyes stayed fixed on her, and their voices dropped to whispers just loud enough to carry a tone, if not the words. Elias's jaw tightened. He stepped subtly between Clara and their gaze, motioning her toward the counter. Mrs. Carver rang up the goods, her voice calm but purposeful, as if to drown out the murmurs. Outside, the heat of the day had already settled over the street. Clara kept her head level now, eyes fixed straight ahead as they walked to the wagon. A few more glances followed her, curious or calculating. It was hard to tell which. As Elias loaded the supplies, a lanky young man leaned against a hitch post nearby, the blacksmith's apprentice. He nodded to Elias, then looked to Clara. "You all right, ma'am?" Clara's answer was quiet but steady. "I am." Elias climbed onto the wagon seat, the leather creaking under his weight. Clara settled beside him, the basket of goods at her feet. They rolled out of town without hurry. The road stretched ahead, long and bare, the grass along its edges browned by the summer heat. For a while, the only sound was the rumble of wheels and the soft thud of hooves. Then she spoke, eyes still on the road. "You didn't let them press. Thank you." "Not my way," he said. The wind caught at her hair, lifting a strand from her braid. She leaned back against the seat just slightly, as if the space between them had changed, if only by a fraction. By the time the cabin came into view, the light had shifted warmer, touching the grass with gold. As they unloaded the supplies, Elias noticed something in her movements. Still careful, but without the same tightness she carried on the way out. Inside, the new goods were stowed neatly in the pantry. On the porch, the patch of soil where she'd planted her flowers was still bare, but Elias thought he saw the faintest hint of green breaking the surface. The days after the trip to town fell into a rhythm. Mornings started early, with the soft clatter of enamel mugs and the smell of coffee drifting through the cabin. Clara had taken to pouring it before Elias came in from the yard, a small act that seemed to settle into place without discussion. By the third morning, she was in the chicken yard when he returned from checking the pasture fence. The sleeves of her green dress were rolled past her elbows, her skirt hitched slightly to keep from dragging in the dust. She scattered grain with deliberate care, watching the birds bustle and cluck around her boots. "Don't have to do that," Elias said, leaning on the fence post. "I want to," she replied without looking up. "Feels better than sitting." It wasn't just the chickens. By midday, she had chopped vegetables for stew, set bread to rise, and arranged the kitchen shelves in an order that made more sense to her than whatever system Elias had kept before. He found her humming at one point, low, almost absent-minded, while she rinsed apples in a tin basin. When she realized he was standing in the doorway, she stopped. But the sound had already lodged itself somewhere in his chest. They ate supper at the table, the fire popping in the stove. Conversation stayed light. Remarks about the weather, the stubborn rooster, the sky turning overcast in the east. Still, there was a shift. Clara no longer kept her eyes lowered the entire time. That evening, as the sun slanted low and turned the porch boards warm underfoot, Elias repaired a saddle strap on the bench. Clara came out carrying 2 mugs of coffee, setting one beside him before taking the other to the railing. "You fix a lot of things," she said after a while. "Things don't fix themselves," he answered. A smile touched the corner of her mouth, small, almost quick enough to miss, but it stayed long enough for him to see. The next afternoon, a stray calf wandered near the fence line. Elias spotted it from the porch and moved to saddle his horse. Clara followed without hesitation. "You stay here," he told her, tightening the cinch. "I can help." "You've still got healing to do." "I can hold a rope." There was no edge in her voice, just a quiet certainty. In the end, he handed her the coil and let her stand by the gate while he rode out to guide the calf back. She looped the rope expertly over the post without needing to be told. When it was done, she met his eyes with a faint, surprised laugh, like she hadn't expected the sound to come out of her. Elias found himself grinning in return, the moment stretching just enough to feel like something had shifted again. That night, clouds gathered low over the horizon, heavy with the promise of rain. The air was thick and still, the kind that made every sound carry. Inside the cabin, Clara moved with an ease that hadn't been there when she first arrived. Still cautious, but not as if every step was a question. Before turning in, she paused by the window, watching lightning flicker far off in the dark. "Storm's coming," she murmured. Elias, setting his hat on the peg, said, "We'll be ready." She didn't turn from the glass, but he saw her shoulders lower, just slightly, as if the words had settled somewhere she needed them. The day had been warm and windless, the kind of heat that settled into the boards of the porch and stayed there. Elias had been sorting tools in the shed, his shirt sticking to his back, when he heard voices drifting faintly from the road. They weren't close, more like the echo of men speaking somewhere down past the cottonwoods near the bend. He wouldn't have noticed except for one thing, the sudden pause in their conversation, then a single name carried just clear enough for him to catch. Clara. He froze, hand resting on the worn handle of a hammer. The voices moved on, swallowed by distance, but something about the way they'd said it, flat, deliberate, sat wrong in his chest. By the time he stepped out into the sunlight, the road was empty. Dust hung in the air where wagon wheels had passed. He didn't mention it when he came back inside. Clara was at the table, slicing carrots for stew, her hair pulled back from her face. She looked up at him and smiled faintly before going back to her work. That evening, while she rinsed the dishes, Elias stood at the window, watching the road in the fading light. His eyes moved over every bend and dip in the land, measuring how far a man could come before being seen. Clara noticed. "You're quiet," she said, stacking the plates. "Long day," he replied, still looking outside. Over the next 2 days, he found excuses to work closer to the cabin, mending the chicken coop, checking the hinges on the barn door, stacking firewood, though the nights were still warm. His gaze kept sliding toward the horizon, but he made sure to keep his voice and movements even. Clara saw through it anyway. On the 3rd afternoon, as they shelled peas on the porch, she glanced sideways at him. "You've been watching the road like it owes you something." He almost smiled. "Maybe it does." Her hands stilled for a moment, the pod half open in her fingers. "If trouble comes, it's because of me, isn't it?" He shook his head. "Trouble finds its own way, always has." She didn't look convinced, but she didn't press. Instead, she went back to shelling, the soft tap of peas against the bowl filling the silence. That night, after she'd gone to bed, Elias stepped out into the yard. The stars were sharp and bright above the dark sweep of the plains. He stood there a long time, listening for anything out of place. Nothing came. But the next morning, he found a scrap of paper tucked under a loose plank of the porch rail. No message, no name, just a half-creased piece of green fabric torn and frayed at the edge. He folded it into his pocket without a word. At breakfast, Clara asked if he'd be riding out to the far pasture. "Not today," he said. Her brow lifted slightly, but she didn't push. She only poured him more coffee, her hand steady, though her eyes seemed to search his face for something she didn't maim. The day went on as usual, chores, the scent of baking bread drifting from the cabin, the sound of chickens in the yard. But a quiet awareness threaded through every moment. They didn't speak of it, but it was there, shaping the air between them. Elias didn't know when or how it would come, but he knew one thing. The road wouldn't stay empty forever. The morning broke clear, the kind of crisp air that made the horizon look nearer than it was. Elias hitched the wagon early, the boards creaking as he tightened the traces. Clara stepped out with a basket tucked under one arm, eggs wrapped in cloth, bread she'd baked the day before. Her green dress, mended so finely the seam was almost invisible, caught the first edge of sunlight. They rode in silence for the first mile, the wheels rumbling over dry ruts. The land was wide and open, a pale gold under the rising sun. Clara's hands rested on the basket in her lap, her eyes scanning the road ahead. By the time they reached the outskirts of town, the air had warmed, and the faint scent of horse and dust wrapped around them. The general store's bell gave a small, tinny ring when they stepped inside. Mrs. Carver looked up from behind the counter, her eyes warming in an instant. "Well, morning to you both," she said, voice gentle. "Clara, it's good to see you again." Clara returned a small smile. "And you, Mrs. Carver." While Elias collected coffee, salt, and flour, Clara moved among the shelves. She touched nothing at first, just walked slowly, as if mapping the space. A couple of women entered, their chatter softening to murmurs as they glanced toward her. One of them whispered something behind a gloved hand. Clara's chin stayed level this time. When they reached the counter, Mrs. Carver slipped an extra packet of tea into the sack. "For the evenings," she said with a wink. Clara's thank you was quiet but sincere. Outside, the sunlight seemed sharper. A few paces down the boardwalk, the blacksmith's apprentice, tall, all elbows, with hair the color of straw, paused beside his cart. He tipped his hat, a shy smile on his face. "Ma'am," he said, voice awkward but polite. Clara nodded. "Good morning." Elias waited by the wagon, his expression unreadable. Once she was settled beside him, he clicked the reins, and the wagon rolled forward. The road home stretched long, the sound of wheels over hard earth steady and slow. Clara watched the horizon, the basket now resting at her feet. "Mrs. Carver's kind," she said after a while. "She is," Elias agreed. A hawk wheeled above the fields, its shadow slipping across the grass. Neither of them spoke for some time, the quiet between them unforced. When the cabin finally came into view, its low roofline against the pale sky, Clara let out a small breath, as if she'd been holding it since they'd left. They unloaded the supplies together. Inside, she stored them neatly in the pantry, lining each bag and jar with care. Elias stepped back outside to unhitch the horse, his eyes sliding toward the road without meaning to. That evening, the scent of stew filled the cabin. They ate in the soft lamplight, and when the dishes were done, Clara stood for a long time at the window, looking toward the darkening hills. Elias came to stand beside her. "You see something?" She shook her head. "No."
"Just thinkin', the road always looks different comin' home." He didn't answer right away, but he understood. Outside, night settled in, the sound of crickets threading through the stillness. The road lay empty under the stars, but the thought lingered, for both of them, that it wouldn't stay that way forever. If you're still watching right now, drop a 1 in the comments so I know you're still with me on this journey. The first sound was faint, just a distant, uneven rhythm on the hardpan road. Elias had been mending a hinge on the barn door when it reached his ears. He straightened, the hammer hanging loose in his hand. The horizon was a pale line of silver against the thinning night, the air still carrying a bite of cold. The rhythm grew sharper. Hooves, not a wagon team, single rider. Elias set the hammer down, stepped into the yard, and moved toward the gate. Through the slow lift of morning haze, a figure emerged. Tall in the saddle, dark coat buttoned high, hat brim low. Even at this distance, the set of the man's shoulders spoke of entitlement. The horse's breath steamed, curling into the air. When the rider reached the gate, he drew up sharply.
"Morning," he said, voice smooth, almost cordial. Elias didn't return the greeting. "You're at the wrong place." A smile touched the man's mouth without reaching his eyes. "I'm exactly where I mean to be. Name's Rourke. I believe you've got something that belongs to me." Elias let the silence stretch. The boards of the gate were cool under his palm. "No one here belongs to you." Behind him, on the porch, movement stirred. Clara stood just inside the shadow of the doorway, one hand braced at her side. She didn't speak, but her presence tightened the air between the men. Rourke's gaze flicked past Elias, catching that glimpse of her, and the smile widened. "There she is. Clara, darlin', come on out now. No sense in pretending." Elias shifted his stance, the sun cutting across his face. "You'll speak to me, not her." The other man leaned slightly in the saddle, measuring him. "This is between me and the lady." "Not anymore," Elias said. Somewhere far down the road, a hawk cried, its voice thin in the cold morning. The light was changing fast. The first true gold of sunrise brushed the fence rails. Elias didn't look away from Rourke. "This gate stays closed," he said. The two men stood in the quiet, the space between them taut as wire. For a moment, nothing moved but the horse's flank, rippling under its coat. Elias knew, as sure as the nail he'd driven into the barn door, that nothing about this morning could be undone. Some doors, once guarded, do not open again. The silence between them held until Clara stepped forward. Her bare feet touched the porch boards without a sound. The morning light catching the faint crease of a seam mended along her skirt. Elias glanced back once, a question in his eyes. She met it with the smallest shake of her head. Rourke straightened in the saddle, that smile fixed in place. "There now," he said softly, "no need to keep up this act. You belong with me, always have." Her voice was quiet, but it carried. "Belonging to you meant never speaking my own mind. Meant counting the coins before you came home, because I didn't know what would happen if I couldn't make them stretch." The smile faltered. A flicker of annoyance crossed his face, but he masked it quickly. "You don't mean that. You're upset. I came to take you back." Elias shifted slightly, keeping himself square between them. "Under my roof," he said. "She stays where she chooses." Rourke's eyes narrowed. "That's so? And what makes you think you can keep her?" Clara stepped down one more tread, the edge of her skirt brushing the packed earth. "Because I'm not yours to keep. You'd rather see me silent than see me free. I won't be silent anymore." For a moment, all Elias could hear was the creak of leather as Rourke's hand tightened on the reins. The man's jaw worked as if chewing over the words, searching for the right one to break the moment. Instead, Clara kept speaking. "You said I belonged to you. What it meant was bruises you never named, doors you locked, and a life small enough to fit in your palm. I'm not going back to that." Rourke gave a short, humorless laugh. "You always were dramatic." Elias didn't look away from him. "She's telling the truth. Whether you think it's dramatic doesn't matter." A hawk's shadow swept over the ground again, brief and cold. Somewhere, a wagon wheel rattled faintly on a far road, the sound inching closer. Rourke's eyes flicked toward it before returning to Elias. "This isn't over." Clara's chin lifted. "Maybe not."
But it's over for today. Elias didn't move, didn't break the line he'd drawn at the gate. Truth, once spoken, was out in the open now, and it had a way of staying. Rourke shifted in the saddle, leaning forward until the brim of his hat cast his eyes into shadow. "You think this ends with a few words on a porch? You're not the first to stand in my way, McKenna. The others—" He let the sentence trail, the threat hanging there like the weight of a loaded gun. Elias didn't flinch. "The others aren't me." The wind slid between them, carrying the dry scent of sage and sun-warmed dust. Elias planted his boots firm in the dirt, shoulders square. He could feel the knot of tension in his chest, but it didn't move him back an inch. "She stays," Elias said, the words steady, not loud. Rourke's jaw tightened. "And if I decide to come back with reason enough to make you step aside?" "Reason?" Elias let the word hang. "You mean force. I've seen it before. That's why you won't get close this time." Rourke's gaze darted toward the road, where the faint rattle of a wagon wheel had grown clearer. The sound carried over the rise, still a ways off, but close enough to matter. Elias saw the calculation in the man's eyes. "Folks notice," he said evenly. "Mrs. Carver, the boy at the forge, they'll remember seeing you here." "That's supposed to scare me?" "No," Elias said. "It's supposed to make you think about how far word travels in a town like this." The horse shifted under Rourke, stamping once. He glanced down at the gate, at the set of Elias's hands, empty but ready. The air was thick with the kind of stillness that could snap either way. A flicker of unease passed across Rourke's face before he masked it again. "You're making this harder than it has to be." "That's the idea," Elias said. The wagon noise grew a little louder. Dust lifted faintly over the far bend, a pale signal that someone was indeed coming. Rourke's eyes cut back toward the road, and Elias knew he'd struck the right nerve. A man could bully a house, but a town was harder. Rourke sat back in the saddle, expression unreadable. For a heartbeat, neither spoke. The hawk's cry came again, thin against the open sky, and the wind shifted toward the west. Elias didn't break his stance. The line was drawn, clear as the strip of dirt between them. Rourke's gaze lingered on the rise where the dust plume from the approaching wagon thickened. The faint sound of voices carried on the wind now, not just the creak of wheels.
He turned the reins slowly in his gloved hand. "You've bought yourself a little time," he said, the tone almost casual, though the muscle in his jaw betrayed the effort it took to say it. "But I'll be seeing you again." Elias didn't move from the gate. "We'll be here." For a moment, Rourke just looked at him, then past him, at Clara standing on the porch. Her knuckles were white against the rail, but her chin was high. He gave a short, cold smile and tugged the reins. The horse pivoted, hooves kicking up small clouds of dust as they turned back down the road. Rourke didn't look over his shoulder, but the rhythm of the hooves seemed sharper, as if he meant to leave the sound behind quickly. Only when the figure had vanished into the shimmer of heat and light did Elias let out the breath he'd been holding. The wagon from town rounded the bend, a pair of farmers heading to market, nodding as they passed without stopping. Elias turned toward the porch. Clara hadn't moved. "You all right?" he asked quietly. She hesitated, then nodded once. "I think so." Her voice carried the tremor of a string plucked too hard, still humming. He stepped up onto the porch, close enough that his shadow fell across her. "You did fine." Her gaze went to the horizon where Rourke had disappeared. "He won't stop." Elias followed her eyes, then said, "Maybe not, but neither will we." Something in his tone steadied her shoulders. She drew in a breath, the kind that fills a person from the inside out. Almost without thinking, she murmured, "I will say of the Lord, He is my refuge and my fortress, my God, in Him will I trust." The words hung there between them, quiet but solid as the boards under their feet. Elias gave a small nod. "That's right." The wind shifted again, bringing the faint scent of sage from the hills. Somewhere beyond sight, the road ran on toward its own miles. For now, though, it was empty, and the gate remained closed. The days that followed settled into a stillness that was not quite peace. Morning light spilled across the plains, the wind carrying the faint rattle of dry seed pods, and every sound seemed sharper, every hoofbeat in the distance, every door slam from the barn. Elias moved through his chores with steady hands, mending fence rails along the north pasture. Each hammer strike echoed against the emptiness, his gaze lifting often toward the ridge that marked the far boundary of his land. From there, a man could approach unseen until he was nearly at the gate. Elias made a habit of glancing that way now. Clara kept to the house and the yard, tending the small patch of flowers she'd planted weeks before. Kneeling in the soil, she pressed her hands into the earth, the gesture almost meditative. The blooms were sparse, just hardy shoots of wild marigold and a few struggling lupines. But she cared for them as if they were rare treasures. Once, Elias passed by with a bucket of nails and paused at the porch rail. "They're coming along," he said. She brushed dirt from her palms and looked up at him. "They grow slow, but they grow." Their conversations were still brief, but the silences between them had shifted. Less guarded, more like the quiet between two people who understand each other without needing to speak. One afternoon, a lone rider appeared on the distant road. Elias stopped in the pasture, eyes narrowing, but the figure veered off toward the river crossing before getting close enough to see clearly. Still, he kept his tools close for the rest of the day. That evening, as they sat on the porch, the sun sank into a haze of gold and violet. Clara set her teacup down and watched the horizon. "Do you think he'll come back soon?" Elias leaned back in his chair. "I think he'll come back when he thinks he can win. That means he's got to believe we're not ready." She considered that for a moment, then said, "Then we'll stay ready." It wasn't said with defiance exactly, but with a calm acceptance, like someone who had decided that vigilance was a kind of living too. From the porch they could see the whole stretch of road, empty under the fading light. The gate stood in its place, weathered but firm, and for now that was enough.
The storm rolled in from the west without much warning, just a sudden drop in temperature and a bank of dark clouds swallowing the horizon. Elias had been checking the far pen when the first low growl of thunder reached him. "Cattle in," he called, his voice cutting across the wind.
Clara was already at the gate, skirts gathered in one hand, the other swinging it open for him. The rain started as a scatter of cold drops, then turned to a hard, steady sheet. They moved quickly, Elias guiding the animals into the barn, Clara latching gates behind them. The ground turned slick underfoot, mud grabbing at their boots. By the time the last heifer was inside, they were both soaked through. Elias pushed the barn door closed against the wind, then glanced at her. Hair plastered to her cheeks, dress clinging in darkened folds. She laughed once, short and breathless, as if the absurdity of the downpour had just caught up to her. They ran for the porch, the rain chasing them in heavy, slanting lines. Elias took the steps 2 at a time, then turned to offer her a hand. She grasped it without hesitation, her palm warm despite the chill. Under the shelter of the porch roof, they caught their breath. The storm roared across the plains, rain drumming against the boards, wind tugging at the edges of the world. Elias reached for the old wool blanket kept folded on the bench and draped it over her shoulders. "You're drenched." She smiled, tucking it tighter around herself.
"So are you." For a moment they just stood there, the smell of wet earth and sage rising up around them. The air was alive with motion, rain sweeping sideways, thunder rolling deep in the belly of the clouds. Then Clara laughed again, fuller this time, the sound bright and unguarded. It rose above the storm for a heartbeat before blending into it, as if the sky had made room for her voice. Elias found himself smiling back, not because he'd meant to, but because something in that laugh left no choice. It wasn't the polite curve of lips he'd seen in town, or the small smiles she gave when thanking him for supper. This was different. It sounded like freedom. And in that moment, with the storm pounding the land and the gates still standing strong, Elias knew the fight they'd chosen was worth it. If you like this video, please comment 9. If you don't like it, please comment number 0. The Texas plains wore a different face as summer faded. The gold of late August grass gave way to the deeper bronze of early autumn. Wind carried a sharper edge now, curling around the eaves of the old homestead in short, restless bursts.
Each morning, frost lay like a silver veil over the fence rails before the sun burned it away. Life at the ranch moved in steady, unhurried patterns, no longer shadowed by the weight of an unwelcome visitor. In the patch of earth beside the porch, green shoots pressed through soil Clara had worked with patient hands. By mid-September, the first blossoms appeared, small, stubborn splashes of color defying the wind. Elias would catch sight of her out there in the slanted light, shoulders straight, her hands gentle but sure among the leaves. It was more than a garden, it was a mark of permanence. Their days began to fold together in quiet harmony. Morning started with the clink of tin mugs, coffee poured in the same rhythm. Elias would take to the pastures, Clara to the house, meeting again to share a noonday meal. It was a life measured in simple tasks, checking dates, stacking firewood, setting chairs side by side on the porch when the work was done. Now and then word drifted in from town. Rourke had been warned by the sheriff to leave the county. Folks said he'd been seen heading east, his temper trailing behind him like dust on the road.
No one claimed to know where he went, and no one seemed inclined to care. The air around the ranch felt cleaner somehow, the horizon less weighted. Elias noticed changes in Clara that went beyond the absence of fear. She hummed when hanging laundry, walked with a looseness in her step, and no longer kept her eyes lowered when passing someone on the road to town. The guarded stillness had given way to something warmer, steadier.
One morning, with the sun sitting low and bright, Elias found her at the clothesline, a row of white shirts swaying between them. He stood there a moment, listening to the cloth snap in the breeze. Then he said, "Stay, as my wife." She looked at him, long enough for the wind to shift and carry the scent of sage between them. Then she nodded, once, certain. The small smile that followed was not polite nor measured. It was open, unguarded. When their hands met, it was without hesitation. The ceremony was as plain as the words they'd spoken to each other. They rode into town together, the buggy wheels crunching over frost-hardened ground. Mrs. Carver stood with them, eyes bright, while the pastor spoke over the small gathering. He read from 1 Corinthians 13:4. "Love is patient, love is kind." His voice carried in the still air, the verse settling into the space between them like a vow older than either of their years. By the time they returned to the ranch, the sun had begun its slow descent. Shadows stretched long across the yard, the horizon holding a pale wash of gold and rose. Elias tied the horse, and together they stepped up onto the porch, the sound of their boots familiar now as the wind in the grass. Inside, Clara placed the folded marriage paper on the mantel, neat and deliberate. The firelight caught the edge of the page, and for a moment it looked as though it glowed. Outside, the land rolled away toward the darkening sky, the air filled with the scent of cedar smoke and the quiet certainty of choices made. What they chose felt larger than the land they kept. The wedding flowers didn't end up in a crystal vase. Clara set them gently into a chipped blue mug, the one that had sat on a shelf in Elias's kitchen for years, holding nothing but dust. The petals, still fresh from the day before, brightened the center of the table. The mug seemed to take to the task as if it had been waiting for it. Around the cabin, subtle changes marked the shift from a one-man dwelling to a shared home. 2 coffee cups now hung on the wall hooks. The second rocking chair on the porch, unused for so long, had been drawn closer to the first, angled just enough so their arms could almost touch. There was a new quilt folded over the back of the sofa, its colors deep and warm against the pale wood. That evening, supper was a simple affair: beans, bread, and slices of roast from the night before. Yet there was a different quality to the meal. It wasn't the quiet of 2 people occupying the same space, but the comfort of a pattern forming, a rhythm that belonged to both of them. A letter arrived by the hand of a ranch hand from town. Inside, the sheriff's careful script confirmed what rumor had already carried. Thomas Rourke had left the county. There had been no charges, no proof that would stand in court. But he was known, his name and face noted in places that mattered. It was as much of a guarantee as the law could offer out here. Clara read the note without trembling, folded it once, and set it aside. Later, Elias found himself thinking of his mother's words from long ago about trust, how a man could work his hardest and still need to place the rest in God's hands. He felt the truth of it now, not as surrender, but as a steadying of the heart. Some burdens were lighter when you didn't try to carry them alone. They moved out to the porch as the day dimmed. The air was cool, heavy with the scent of sage and cedar smoke drifting from the chimney. Stars began to prick through the indigo sky, first in singles, then in clusters. Clara leaned against his shoulder, her breathing even, her hands resting quietly in her lap. After a long moment, she spoke. "Home is where someone tells you you can stay." Her voice was soft, but it carried a weight that Elias understood without needing to answer. His hand found hers, and they sat like that until the air turned cold enough to see their breath. Out beyond the yard, the road wound into the darkness, the same road that could one day bring strangers or storms. But inside the gate, the order of things had changed. This was not the lonely outpost it had once been, but a place where 2 people chose to keep watch together. The wind sighed through the grass, the horses shifted in the corral, and the light from the cabin spilled a golden path onto the porch boards.
Elias looked out over the land, the same land he had worked for decades. It had always been something to hold on to, something to protect. Now it was also something to share. The house remembered 2 breaths and would from now on. The wind over the Texas plains has a way of carrying more than just dust. It carries memories. For some, it's the echo of boots on a wooden porch, the smell of fresh-cut hay, or the warm glow of lamplight spilling from a cabin window. Clara and Elias's story is more than a tale of survival. It's a reminder that even in the loneliest corners of the frontier, love can take root, heal old wounds, and turn a house into a home. If you've ever known the quiet strength of standing by someone, or the deep peace of knowing you belong, you've felt what built the true Wild West stories. These aren't just about gunfights and gold. They're about the people who chose kindness over fear and hope over despair. Stay with us for more true Wild West stories, where courage wears a humble face and love rides quietly beside it.